The raiders thought her baby would never survive, but the Navajo mother proved them all wrong. In the distant future, Earth was not the place it used to be. The once green plains and deserts had been transformed into harsh, barren lands dotted with the wreckage of old battles and abandoned cities. The human race had spread across the stars, and with it came the greed for resources that no longer existed on their home planet. But there were still some people who lived on Earth, clinging to the old ways, the traditions of their ancestors. Among them was Kia, a Navajo mother, living on a small, isolated settlement in the high desert. Kia had been born on Earth, but her ancestors had always been connected to the land. They knew its rhythms, its dangers, its strengths. Kia had inherited this knowledge, and as a mother, she had passed it on to her son Sonny. He was only a few months old, but already he had his mother's spirit. She loved him more than anything. He was all she had left after the death of his father in an old war that had long since been forgotten by the outside world. The settlement was quiet. The wind howled through the canyon walls, carrying the scent of dry earth and the faint hum of distant storms. Kia had lived here her whole life, and it had always been her refuge. But that day, the quiet was shattered by the sound of engines. The roar of ships broke the silence, growing louder as they approached. Kia felt her heart race. She stood, holding Sonny close, her fingers trembling. "They're here," she whispered to herself, eyes scanning the horizon. It was a rare thing for anyone to come this far out into the desert. The only ones who came to this part of the world were raiders, outlaws who plundered the land and took what they wanted. Kia had heard stories of these groups, who used advanced technology to take whatever they could find. They were ruthless, and they didn't care for the old ways. They only cared about power and control. Kia could hear the ships landing, the engines thrumming as they settled into the dusty earth. She had no weapons to fight them, only her knowledge of the land. But that was not enough. She had to protect her son. She quickly made her way to the small shelter she had built against the rocks. The walls were sturdy, but it wouldn't hold against the firepower these raiders carried. She had to leave, and she had to do it now. Sonny cried, his tiny voice carrying through the shelter. Kia soothed him, kissing the top of his head, and whispered, "It's all right, little one. Mama will keep you safe." She tucked him into a leather pouch strapped to her back. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She moved quickly, her feet carrying her over the familiar paths, the ones she had walked all her life. The settlement, small and quiet, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what was coming. Kia reached the edge of the cliffs, her heart pounding as she looked back one last time. The raiders had landed near the settlement, and from the shadows of the rocks, she could see them moving toward her home. They were here to take everything. Kia knew that the raiders didn't care for the people who lived on this land. To them, the people were nothing more than obstacles. They didn't know the history of the land, nor did they care. They had no respect for the ways of the old. But Kia did, and she would fight for it. She moved through the desert, careful to keep out of sight, the weight of her child on her back, a constant reminder of what she had to protect. The dry sand scraped against her skin, but Kia pushed on. She had to find safety somewhere far from here. As she crested the ridge, she could hear the sounds of the raiders in the distance. Their voices were loud and harsh, cutting through the air like a knife. They were searching for anything of value, anything they could take. Kaya's heart sank as she imagined what they might do to the people who had once lived here. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Not to her, and not to Sanny. The desert was vast, and Kia knew the old ways to survive. She could hide in the caves, the ones that ran deep beneath the earth, known only to her people. She knew how to find water in the driest of places, how to track the stars, and how to use the land to her advantage. Kia walked for hours, feeling the weight of the journey settle into her bones. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the desert. She stopped to rest beneath a canyon wall, the only shelter for miles. She pulled Sonny from her back and held him close, her heart swelling with love for him. He was everything to her, the reason she kept going. She had to make sure he survived. As the wind began to pick up, Kia felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just the cold. It was the feeling that something was wrong, that the raiders were closer than she thought. She couldn't stop. She had to keep moving. The night was falling fast, and with it came the dangers of the desert. There were predators out here, creatures that had adapted to the harsh climate, blending into the rocks and the sand. Kia had faced them before, but never like this. She had to get to the caves where it would be safe. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a growl in the distance. Kia's instincts kicked in, and she dropped to the ground, pulling Sonny close. The growl was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, the unmistakable tread of a large creature. It was coming closer. Kia held her breath, her fingers curled around the rough stone. She couldn't afford to make a sound. The creature paused, sniffing the air, and Kia could feel its eyes on her, but she stayed still, waiting for the right moment. It took several long minutes, but eventually the creature moved on, its growl fading into the night. Kia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was safe, for now. But the raiders were still out there, and they weren't the only danger she had to face. As the desert night closed in around her, Kia knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous. But she would keep fighting, for Sani, for the land, and for the future of her people. The raiders had made a mistake. They thought Sani wouldn't survive. They thought the land would give up its secrets. But Kia was stronger than they realized. She wasn't going to let them win. The desert stretched out before Kia like an endless sea of sand and rock. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. She knew the desert well, but even the harsh land that had always been her home felt different now. There was a heaviness in the air, an unsettling stillness that made her senses sharpen. Every step felt like it echoed through the earth, every breath a reminder of how much she had to lose. Sani, wrapped snugly on her back, slept soundly in the pouch she had fashioned from animal hide. His tiny chest rose and fell with each gentle breath. Kia could feel the warmth of his body against her back, and it reminded her why she had to keep moving. She couldn't let the raiders find him. She couldn't let them destroy the last piece of her family. The world around her seemed to shift, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and something else. Something unfamiliar. Kia stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. She turned her head, scanning the horizon. There was nothing but the rolling dunes and jagged cliffs in every direction. But her instincts told her something was wrong. She could feel eyes on her, as if the very earth was watching her every move. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. "You've survived worse." She knew how to find shelter in the rock formations, how to track animals, and how to find water when there was none to be found. But this journey was different. This time it wasn't just about surviving. It was about protecting Sani, and finding a way to keep him safe from the raiders who believed he wouldn't survive the harsh desert. With each passing hour, Kia grew more aware of the dangers lurking in the wilderness. The desert was home to creatures that had adapted to the harsh conditions, from the scorpions that hid beneath the rocks to the enormous mechanical predators that the raiders had left behind. There was always something ready to strike. Kia's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of a distant hum. It was low at first, but as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder. Kia's heart sank. It was the sound of engines, the unmistakable noise of a ship descending from the sky. She crouched low, pulling Sani closer to her chest as she pressed herself against the rough stone of the canyon wall. The ship passed overhead, its shadow sweeping across the desert like a dark cloud. Kia held her breath, waiting for the sound to fade into the distance. When it did, she slowly exhaled, her heart still pounding in her chest. The raiders were still searching for her. She couldn't stay here. She had to keep moving. Kia knew that if the raiders found her trail, it would be the end for both her and Sani. They were ruthless. If they caught her, they would take everything. With a final glance over her shoulder, Kia rose to her feet and continued her journey. The desert was vast, and she had no idea where she was headed, but she knew she had to go. There was something deep inside her that told her that the answers lay ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon. As the day wore on, the heat grew unbearable. Kia felt the sweat pouring down her face, stinging her eyes. The ground beneath her feet seemed to burn with every step, but she kept going, focusing on the task at hand, keeping Sani safe and finding shelter before the nightfall. She knew the dangers of the desert at night, mechanical beasts that roamed the dark, seeking out the warmth of any living creature. Hours passed, and the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Kia's body ached, but she pushed forward, knowing she couldn't stop. She had to find water. She had to find food. She had to keep going for Sani's sake. Then, as if answering her silent prayers, Kia spotted a small cave in the distance. It was barely visible against the rocky landscape, but it was there, hidden from view by the natural formations of the canyon walls. Kia quickened her pace, her legs aching with every step. The shadows were lengthening and the temperature was dropping. She didn't have much time. As she neared the cave, Kia took a moment to rest, her breath coming in short gasps. She could hear Sani stirring in the pouch, and she gently rocked back and forth, soothing him with soft words. The sound of his cooing was a small comfort in the midst of the harsh world around them. Once inside the cave, Kia set down her belongings and gently pulled Sani from the pouch. She placed him on a bed of dried grass and animal skins. carefully covering him with a thin blanket she had made. Sonny whimpered slightly, his tiny hands reaching up toward her. Kia smiled softly, her heart swelling with love for her son. He was her strength, her reason to keep fighting. With Sonny settled for the moment, Kia took a few moments to catch her breath. She looked around the cave, assessing her surroundings. It was small but deep, offering enough shelter from the wind and the night creatures that roamed outside. She could rest here for the night, but she couldn't stay long. She had to keep moving. The raiders were out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. Kia knew that the journey ahead would only get harder. She couldn't hide in caves forever. She had to find a way to fight back. She had to protect her son. But how? She had no weapons. The raiders had technology on their side, and she was just a mother trying to survive. There had to be more. There had to be something more she could do. That's when the vision came. It started as a whisper in the back of her mind, like a soft wind passing through the canyon. But it grew louder, until it was a clear voice, speaking to her in a language she hadn't heard in years. Her grandmother's voice. The voice of the elders who had passed on long ago. "The land is with you," the voice said. "The power is in your blood, Kia. Your ancestors are here." Kia froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't heard these words in years, since she was a child. She'd been taught the old ways, but the teachings had always seemed like stories, like dreams. But now, as she sat in the cave with her son, the words felt real. Her heart beat faster as the realization struck her. Sonny was more than just her son. He was part of something much greater, a link to the old ways, to the power that had once been in the land itself. Kia didn't understand it all, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone. Her ancestors were with her, guiding her on this journey. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something much larger, for the land, for her people, and for Sanny, the one who would carry their legacy forward. Kia took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't just a mother. She was a protector, a warrior. And the raiders would soon learn that the land had a power they could never understand. With renewed strength, Kia knew that the next step of her journey would be even more dangerous. But she was ready, and she would not let her son's future slip away. The desert was relentless. Day after day, the sun beat down without mercy, and the wind carried with it the dry heat of the land. Kia had traveled far from the place she once called home, and with each passing hour, the journey felt more impossible. Yet she could feel something within her, a strength she hadn't known existed, urging her forward. It was the strength of her ancestors, the power they had left for her to carry. And it was for Sonny that she pressed on, determined to find safety. For days she had moved from one shelter to the next, always watching the horizon, always listening for the sound of the raiders' ships. Every night she rested in caves or behind large rocks, keeping herself hidden, but she knew it wouldn't last forever. The raiders were relentless. They wouldn't stop until they found her. It was late one afternoon, as the sky turned a deep orange with the setting sun, that Kia heard something unexpected. A soft, distant hum of engines, a noise she had not heard before. She had become so attuned to the sound of raider ships that it only took a moment for her to recognize that this wasn't the same. It was slower, quieter, and it seemed to be coming from the ground, not the sky. Kia's heart raced. She crouched low, pulling Sonny tightly to her chest, and moved toward the rocks, her senses on high alert. The hum grew louder, then stopped.
She waited. Silence.
Then, from behind a cluster of boulders, a figure appeared. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, but with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a strange device hanging from his belt. His eyes were sharp, scanning the desert around him, and when he saw Kia, he froze for a moment. His face was weathered, as if he had spent many years in the desert, but there was a gentleness to his expression when he saw her. "I didn't expect to find anyone out here," he said cautiously, his voice low and wary. "Are you alone?" Kia didn't answer right away. She studied him, trying to read his intentions. He didn't look like a raider. His clothes were too worn, too practical for someone who plundered. But still, she had learned to trust few people in this world. "I'm alone for now," Kia said finally, her voice firm but not unkind. "What do you want?" The man took a step closer, his hands raised slightly, as if trying to show he meant no harm. "I'm just trying to survive," he said. "Name's Dakota. I've been roaming the desert for years, scavenging, surviving. And you? You look like you're running from something." Kaya didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to reveal too much. But Dakota seemed different from the others. His voice wasn't filled with greed, and his posture was open, not threatening. "We're being hunted," Kia said softly, her eyes scanning the desert around them. "By raiders. They've been after me and my son." Dakota's expression shifted. His gaze softened with understanding, and he nodded slowly. "I know the type. I've had my run-ins with them." He paused, looking at the baby on her back. "You've got a son, huh?" "I didn't see him before." Kia nodded, her arms tightening around Sonny instinctively. "He's all I have left," she said. "And they think he's nothing more than a burden. But they're wrong." Dakota studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "They think your son is a burden? Sounds like they don't know much about what they're dealing with. But listen, if you're running, you're going to need more than just luck to survive out here. The desert isn't kind." Kia felt a flicker of doubt. She had been alone for so long, and the thought of trusting someone, anyone, felt foreign. But her instincts told her that Dakota wasn't like the raiders. He wasn't there to take what he could, and maybe, just maybe, he could help her. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, still cautious. Dakota's expression softened even more, and he held up his hands. "You don't have to trust me," he said quietly. "But if you don't, you'll be out here alone. And alone isn't a good place to be." "I'm not looking for trouble, I'm just trying to survive." Kia hesitated for a moment before she slowly nodded. "All right. But you stay away from my son." Dakota nodded solemnly, as if he understood the weight of her words. "I'm not here to harm him, I promise." And so they began their journey together. Dakota led the way through the rocky hills and narrow canyons, guiding Kia to a small, hidden outpost deep within the desert. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a place to regroup. The outpost was abandoned, the structures falling apart, but there was enough shelter for them to stay hidden for a while. As Kaya settled down with Sani, Dakota began to gather what little supplies were left in the ruins. There wasn't much, but he made sure they had water and food for the next few days. It wasn't luxury, but it was enough to survive. Over the next few days, Kia learned more about Dakota. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than anything he could say. He helped her rebuild her strength, repairing some of the equipment she had salvaged, and sharing the small knowledge he had of surviving in the wasteland. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Kia began to feel the weight of her isolation lift, just a little. As the days passed, they grew more comfortable in each other's company. But Kia remained cautious. She couldn't forget that he was still a stranger, and in this world, strangers could be dangerous. But she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a threat. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, Dakota spoke up. "You're not like the others, are you?" "What do you mean?" "The raiders," Dakota explained, his voice thoughtful. "They're after more than just survival. They want control, power. But you're different. You're fighting for something more. You're fighting for your son." Kaya looked into the fire, her thoughts drifting. She had been fighting for so long that she had almost forgotten why. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was trying to protect something important, something the raiders couldn't understand. "I'm fighting for his future," she said quietly. "For the land." "For everything we've lost." Dakota nodded, as if understanding. "I get that. I've been fighting for a long time, too, just trying to stay one step ahead of the people who want to take everything from me." Kia looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. They weren't so different after all. Both of them were survivors, and in that moment, Kia realized that she wasn't truly alone. She had found an ally, someone who understood the fight, who understood the desert, and most importantly, who understood the value of protecting what mattered most. As the night grew colder, Kia felt a sense of relief that she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a while, she allowed herself to hope that maybe they would survive this after all. Kia stood on the edge of the canyon, her eyes scanning the horizon. The desert stretched out before her like an ocean of sand, with nothing but the endless sky above. She felt the weight of the journey pressing down on her shoulders. For days, she and Dakota had traveled together, their bond growing stronger with every step. They had learned to trust each other, relying on their skills and the little supplies they had left. But now, they had reached a turning point. Kia could feel it in her bones. The raiders were close, and their search for Sani was more determined than ever. She had hoped that the desert would hide them, that they could remain undetected. But the land was no longer enough. The raiders were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Dakota stood beside her, his gaze steady and calm. He had been a quiet companion throughout their journey, but his presence had been a comfort to Kia. He had shown her how to survive in the harshest of conditions, how to read the desert, and how to fight back when there was no other choice. But now, it was time for more than just survival. It was time to face the raiders head-on. "They'll be here soon," Dakota said, his voice low. "We don't have much time." Kia nodded, her eyes narrowing. "We need to make sure they don't get close. We can't let them find us." She had been prepared to run, to keep hiding and moving from place to place. But now she knew that it was no longer an option. They couldn't outrun the raiders. They couldn't hide forever. The time had come to stand and fight. Dakota moved to the small pile of equipment they had salvaged, pulling out a few tools and weapons he had collected along the way. He handed her a blaster, its weight unfamiliar but reassuring in her hands. She wasn't a fighter by nature, but she had learned to defend herself when needed, and now, with Sonny's life on the line, she had no choice but to fight. "Do you think we can hold them off?" Kia asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Dakota looked at her, his expression serious. "We'll have to. The raiders aren't the only threat out here. They're armed, but they don't know the land like we do. We can use that to our advantage." Kia's mind raced. The desert had always been her home, and it had taught her how to survive. But this wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about protecting everything she had left. It was about keeping Sonny safe, no matter the cost. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, Kia and Dakota prepared for the fight ahead. They set up traps along the narrow paths, hiding in the rocks and waiting for the raiders to approach. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and the distant hum of engines. The raiders were getting closer. Kia's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind a boulder, her fingers tightening around the blaster. Sonny was asleep in the shelter they had made, safe for the moment. She couldn't afford to think about what might happen if the raiders found him. She had to focus. She had to keep her mind sharp. Dakota positioned himself on the other side of the canyon, his eyes scanning the desert below. He had set up a series of explosives to slow the raiders down, and now it was just a waiting game. The raiders would be forced to pass through the narrow pass, and if everything went according to plan, they would be trapped. Minutes passed like hours. Every gust of wind, every distant sound, made Kia's heart race. She felt the weight of the blaster in her hands, the unfamiliar power it held. It wasn't a weapon she was used to, but in this moment, it felt like the only thing standing between her and everything she loved. Suddenly, the sound of engines grew louder. The raiders had arrived. Kia's breath caught in her throat. They were close. Too close. From her position, she could see the raiders' ships coming into view, their engines roaring as they descended toward the canyon floor. There were 5 of them, all heavily armed, their weapons gleaming in the fading light. Kia's hands tightened around the blaster. This was it. She could see Dakota move into position, his face set with determination. He was ready. And so was she. The first raider stepped into the narrow pass, his boots crunching on the gravel. Kia raised the blaster, taking aim. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, the rush of adrenaline making her hands shake. But she kept her focus. She had to protect Sonny. She had to protect their future. With a quick movement, Kia fired. The blaster crackled, sending a burst of energy toward the raider. He fell to the ground, his body twitching as the blast knocked him off his feet. The other raiders scattered, taking cover behind rocks and debris. Kia's heart raced as she watched them regroup. She had hit one, but there were still 4 more to deal with. They weren't going to give up easily. Dakota's voice came through her earpiece, calm and steady. "Stay focused, we can do this." Kia nodded, her eyes darting to the horizon. The raiders were circling, trying to flank them. They were smart, but they didn't know the land like Kaya did. She had the advantage. "Dakota, now!" Kia shouted. Dakota triggered the explosives, sending a loud explosion echoing through the canyon. The ground shook beneath their feet as the raiders were momentarily stunned by the blast. Kia took her chance and fired again, hitting another raider square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling from his hands. But the fight wasn't over. The remaining raiders charged forward, their weapons blazing. Kia and Dakota returned fire, the sound of the blasters ringing out in the desert. Kia's mind raced, her body moving on instinct as she fired shot after shot, taking down raider after raider. She wasn't thinking about the danger. She wasn't thinking about herself. All she could think about was Sonny and how she couldn't let these people destroy him. With a final, desperate push, Kaya and Dakota managed to take down the last raider. The canyon fell silent, the dust settling in the air. Kia stood there, panting, her chest heaving as she looked at the bodies of the raiders scattered across the ground. It was over. For now. She lowered her blaster, her hands shaking. The adrenaline was fading, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. They had won, but at what cost? Dakota approached, his face grim but relieved. "We did it. They're gone." Kia nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "We did." But as she looked out over the canyon, she knew that this victory wasn't the end. The raiders would regroup. They would send more. But for now, she had done what needed to be done. She turned back toward the shelter where Sonny lay, safe and sound. She had protected him. She had fought for him. And she would continue to do so, no matter what came next. Kia had survived. And now she had to ensure that Sonny's future would be one of freedom and hope. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time she allowed herself to believe that they might just make it.